In this video, I want to talk about out-of-hours support. What is it? How do different companies manage it? And how should you think about on-call if you are trying to implement it at your company? If you're watching this video, you probably already know what out-of-hours support is. It's about how you manage incidents when engineers are not working. So customers usually expect software to run 24/7, but engineers only work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, or some variation of that. So what happens if the system goes down at 4 a.m. on a Saturday? This is why most companies implement an on-call system. Now, I'll talk about how companies organize on-call and talk about the different variations. So the first thing to mention is software. Large companies may implement their own system. For example, I believe Google does this. But smaller companies typically use off-the-shelf software. My company, for example, use PagerDuty, and this is one of the most popular tools for managing on-call. PagerDuty manages the whole life cycle of on-call, from setting up teams and schedules to managing incidents and writing up resolution notes. Personally, I think PagerDuty is very good, so I recommend it if you're not sure what tool to use. Now, in terms of who goes on call for which systems, there are a few ways to manage it. One way is to have a global rota, where you'll have one or maybe a few engineers on call, and they're effectively on call for everything, every system at your company. This can work well for smaller companies, particularly if your company has a monolith or it has a small number of applications. Another alternative is you could have some level of separation. So you could have a back-end support rota and a front-end support rota. Then at the other end of the spectrum, you can have each team with their own on-call schedule to support their own application. And this is the you build it, you run it, you support it approach that a lot of larger companies implement. So for example, this is the model that Amazon and Google use. And for them, it's necessary because they have far too many systems to be supported by one person. And also consider that their systems produce, or some of their systems produce so much revenue and have very strict SLAs that it makes business sense to have more people on call overall. So I touched on some of the trade-offs. Let's go into that a bit more. With a global company rota, it is easier and more cost-effective to resource. Imagine you have 50 engineers in the company. For a global rota, perhaps you only need 10 on the rota, and one at any one time. The downside is that the person can become more of a triager. As the company grows, one person isn't going to be able to understand deeply all the systems in the company. And so if you're going to do this, you need to have very good escalation policies. So the engineer can escalate when they're unsure of an issue's impact. Actually, on this point, I have a story. A personal story. When I was at a previous company, I was on call and I got paged at, let's say, 3 a.m. I believe it was, between 3 and 4 a.m. And it was actually over the Christmas period, so I wasn't working at this time at all, but I volunteered to go on call. And a messaging queue, which the system I was supporting consumed from, had gone down. But I wasn't able to restart or to fix the issue with this messaging queue, and so and also I wasn't able to escalate to anyone, and so I basically sat there at my laptop from 3 a.m. until 9 a.m. the next day when someone from the ops team came online and was able to fix this issue. which wasn't very fun. So just a little story to illustrate that you need to have a very good escalation policy. Now with team-based, you'll have engineers who understand their domain a lot better, and they're able to fix things without escalating. They'll understand which PRs were recently merged and might be causing an issue that can be rolled back, things like that. However, it can be hard to resource because you don't want people to be on call too frequently. Imagine if you had a very small team of 3 people. People will be on call every single month. In fact, sometimes more than once a month. So it's just too much. Now, I touched on weekly rotations there. And so you might ask, how long do people typically stay on call? I see 1 week rotations as the industry standard. I haven't seen any other alternative to that. I think a week rotation works well because it's short enough that it doesn't impact people's it doesn't impact engineers' personal lives too much. If you went any shorter, it might be more convenient for engineers, but it will be very difficult to manage. Another thing I want to talk about is how quickly engineers should respond. Typically, what I've seen before at companies I've worked at is a 20 to 30 minute expectation. So you're expected to not fix, but from the moment you get pinged about an incident, you're expected to be at a machine investigating it within 20 to 30 minutes. However, that will depend on the component you're supporting's SLA. So an interesting example is if you have an SLA of 99.99, then that is 13 minutes downtime per quarter, I believe. So if that's your SLA, you're going to have to be very speedy in how quickly you respond. Next, I want to talk about making on-call compulsory or voluntary. Different companies approach it differently. For example, Amazon has a famous rigorous culture around on-call support, and I believe they make it mandatory for all software engineers at AWS at least. Other companies have a voluntary approach, and there's a good podcast which I'll link to from Intercom. And they have a voluntary system. They have a global voluntary on-call support system, which works very well for them. The nice thing about voluntary on-call is that you're acknowledging that on-call doesn't work for everybody, particularly engineers who've got young families. It can be very, very disruptive. The obvious downside is that it's harder to resource. So it works well for a global support rota, but not so well for a team rota. Imagine you had a team of 6 and only 2 people volunteer. That's obviously not enough. The other thing to note is in this podcast with Intercom, they mentioned that they pay €1,000 per on-call shift, which is obviously very good pay. I would say that's above the average for on-call. So if you compensate well, people are more likely to volunteer. So that takes us on to the topic of compensation. I know some companies don't compensate for on-call support. My understanding is that Amazon don't. It's part of the contract that you sign when you join the company. Other companies do. My company does compensate, and companies I've worked for previously have also compensated for it. There are different ways to compensate for it. You could do it based on the number of incidents that are resolved, but I think the fairest way to do it is to just pay for to compensate people for being on the rota. So for the number of days that you spend on call. And it's fairer because you are acknowledging that on call is a disruption. So even if you don't get paged, you can't go on holiday, you can't go to a party and drink alcohol. You can't, typically it affects your sleep. So you're compensating for those factors. Lastly, I wanted to talk about strategies for making on-call as unstressful as possible, reducing stress as much as possible. And there's a really good section about this in Google's SRE sort of handbook, the documentation. I'll link to it in this video. But there's a few ways you can do this. First of all, is to have a very clear escalation path. And you remember the story I gave about being woken up at 3 a.m. That was pretty stressful. And if I'd had a clear escalation path, which people in the escalation path had responded to, it would have made the situation much better for me. The other one is having very well-defined incident management procedures, and also onboarding people effectively, because when you get woken up in the middle of the night, you might have some adrenaline. You're probably not thinking as clearly as you might do otherwise. So it's important that processes are very well understood and easy to follow. And then the last one is to have a blameless post-mortem culture. And this is very important because it relaxes the engineer. They know they're not going to get in trouble for making a mistake. And also the post-mortem is very important to diagnose the issue once it's been fixed and prevent similar issues from happening in the future. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this useful, and I'll see you in the next one.